Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's a fantastic pleasure to have the opportunity to interview one of my, I was going to say personal heroines, but I'm not sure we're allowed to say that anymore, are we? Heroes. Alka is, as we know, the guiding light of Don't Divide Us, and also a mighty champion of education in the fullest sense of that word, what Matthew Arnold described as what was best was thought and written and said, the best, the very best. And I would dearly love to have been a student in Alka's class when she was a teacher. I don't think she'd have liked to have been a student in my class in Southall in 1983, which was pretty chaotic. We will be focusing on this fantastic new report from Don't Divide Us, Who Are the Experts, an investigation into anti-racist third-party organisations. It's got some fairly shocking findings. I'd like to start by talking about something that Alka said to me the other weekend when your son was graduating from Cambridge, and you talked about the pictures of him with this naturally very mixed group of people, and you said, what a wonderful country. And my son, who's graduating this year also from London University, and I said that you'd said, what a wonderful country, and he said, Mum, no one says that anymore. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's just so deeply sad, and really that's the reason that, you know, that puts the fire in my belly, if you like, that I don't want that story to become the only narrative and the main narrative that the next generation grow up with. Because just from my own personal story, as well as the evidence, and you know, if you go by attitudinal surveys, and just look around. I mean, there are very few countries as liberal as Britain. There are very few countries who have managed to, somehow to encompass such a plurality that, yes, came originally from its colonial relationships, and then that mutated through the Commonwealth. But if it were not for the Commonwealth, I would not have met my husband, who I think should be here somewhere. We would not have married, and we would not have our lovely children. So, you know, I have lots to thank the British Empire and the Commonwealth for, even though at the same time you can politically disagree and even fight against it. You know, it's just the, you know, there's complexity in people, there's complexity in life, and there should be complexity in the way we understand history. And Britain has managed to create enough social space so that people from Africa, India, all over the world can come here and they can have their own faith. They can learn their own languages. They can eat their own food in the way they want to. And also they can be part of a common culture. And that's so important, because if we don't have that sense of wanting to belong to a common culture, of being able to feel there is a culture that we wish to belong to, then the plurality will be very difficult, and it will turn into a fractious Hobbesian free-for-all, which I fear is rather what we're seeing.
Yeah. One of my favourite stories from my brief teaching career was, it was when I was doing teacher training at King's London. It was very much teach them about their own culture, not about ours. So we all dutifully did that. And I was in one lesson and teaching a book about an Indian short story with snakes in a riverbed. And one of the girls, I think she was Bangladeshi actually, she put her hand up and she said, "Excuse me, miss," she says, "we're British, we don't like stuff like that, we like ice skating." And I've always felt that was an absolute touchstone of how to proceed. Now, in 2022, you produced a report called Who's in Charge?, which found that 89% of local authorities in your sample had used or endorsed third-party organisations to provide schools with anti-racist policies, training and classroom resources, often under the umbrella of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. Why did you think it was important to do a second report now?
Well, because what we found in that report was that the most partisan councils, including Brighton and Hove and councils like Lewisham, that they were using materials and organisations who nobody kind of knew who they were, right? Their provenance, if you like, was very hard to find. You could go on their websites and find a little bit of information, but it was very difficult. So that kind of piqued our curiosity. And we were thinking, well, you know, we really must look into this. And then in other spheres of public discussion, the question of third-party providers and the question of trans ideology in schools was coming into public light as well. And that kind of reinforced the sense that something is happening in schools that the Department of Education has either no sight of or knows but is deliberately turning away, that all the universities, the professional bodies, the exam boards, the local educational authorities, not one of these gatekeepers of what goes into our children's minds were really looking at this. They were more concerned about turkey twizzlers going into children's tummies than they are into the ideas and the ethical and intellectual development of our children.
I think most parents, I mean, one of the things that shocked me about the report, I think most parents would just think that, you know, that there's a curriculum and that teachers teach the curriculum. I think this idea of third-party organisations would be very surprising to lots of parents, don't you think?
I'm not sure that it would. I mean, I would hope it would, and it should be. But I think for a long time there is and I think sort of William Hague mentioned this on radio, Times Radio this morning. He said there are new areas of knowledge that it would take, you know, goodness knows how long to train the whole teaching workforce to come up to speed with. So you might need experts coming in to do things like that.
Or something, yeah.
But, the huge but is, we're talking about core ethical values, how you treat people, how you conduct relationships, what your view is of your fellow citizens of your nation, the country you live in, other countries, etc. These are core values, and they should not, you know, these are, for a start, in the British education system, they've traditionally been the job of parents to teach directly, and schools, in as far as they deal with those things, have taught them indirectly. This has been the contract, if you like, unwritten contract between parents and schools, that the schools teach certain values and dispositions that you need to study to become a pupil, to become a good pupil, a pupil identity, not a Pakistani, a Nigerian, or this or that social identity, but a very unique one. And these things are being outsourced to third-party organisations who have, having looked at a fair sample of them, I would say they're just simply not qualified and they don't have the right values to be in schools. You know, it sounds very judgmental, and it's taken me a long time to come to this point because naturally I'm quite liberal and don't like judging things too easily. But, you know, I can really say that, hand on heart, most of these third-party organisations who are going in to an open door with no scrutiny and telling children that if they're white, their country is terrible and they have an unspoken sin to be ashamed of, and telling people who are non-white that if they want to succeed, no matter how hard they try, their success will depend on somebody vacating a place for them, is really, really corrosive and damaging. And you cannot educate in that situation because you have people stepping on eggshells. And to educate, you need to be free to ask questions. And, you know.
Alka sent me a photograph, which I think a parent had sent you, was from an East Anglian junior school. And it was a book display in the junior school, and it was all these kind of anti-racialist books, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely astonishing. And the thing you said to me, which really made me laugh, was there were no black children in the school in the Fens at all. So all the children of, you know, Polish people and Hungarian people and so on. Yes. So they were completely baffled, and the parent was basically saying, "What are these books doing there?" So I said to you, what are the teachers putting up that display? What are they thinking? Do they think this is a nice thing to do? Why are they doing that to the children?
Well, okay, so I think there's broadly two categories of teachers, or if you like, in the educational landscape. Not just teachers, but also senior leadership and people in exam boards, etc. And there will be a small group of them, probably a minority, who genuinely think they are on history's side, who genuinely think that everything up to yesterday is devalued because it's out of date, it's no longer relevant, and this new knowledge, which actually isn't new, but it seems new because the social circumstances are new. This new knowledge has to be disseminated, and no alternative can be brooked, because to have an alternative would be to accept the alternatives would be to show up the intellectual impoverishment of their own ideas. Yeah, so it has to be quite authoritarian to protect itself. So that is the minority group. And then I think you have a majority of teachers who will be a mixture, and the profession, unfortunately, has been hugely de-intellectualised over decades, which is a tragedy, not just for the teachers, but for the pupils. And they will simply be, as you say, wanting to do the right thing, nice. Right? They want to be nice. And so they see it in very individualised terms, like, oh, well, this is just me or just our school and just our pupils. And they can't really, there isn't as yet a big enough social framework in which they can see their experiences in a bigger pattern and see, no, actually, this might seem like being nice to me, but if I endorse this idea, it is actually contributing to quite a harmful social narrative.
One of the books, which is a picture book, so it's for very young children, which was on that display, which you said to me this was a particularly egregious example. I actually ordered it from Amazon. I was in shock.
Oh no!
No, I mean, probably being a terrible waste of money. I mean, it was just kind of political, partisan, the idea, and it was. George Orwell talks about in Politics in the English Language, he says that whenever a politician is speaking, or anybody who's basically telling an untruth, he talks about them speaking in prefabricated sections of a chicken coop, okay? They're not speaking in authentic language, they're just bolting together bits. And this was bolted together political bias, directed at small children. And today, now, people have probably seen the report's been getting a lot of coverage in the Telegraph and the Sunday Times. And there was a story that arose just today of Church of England school pupils being taught in Ipswich, in Suffolk, rural Suffolk, that they benefit from white privilege and they benefit from the systematic oppression of people of colour. What's that teaching doing to those? Is that going to be at all helpful for those children to be told that they're systematic oppressors of people?
No, I honestly don't know what the Church of England is thinking. I think they've lost the plot entirely. And I'm not Christian and not religious, particularly, though I have a lot of sympathy with religion, I have to say. But, you know, this is... I can't believe, you know, a religion that, to me, but part of its beauty is that one of its tenets is that we're all moral equals, to be judged by God, if you believe in God, you know, when the day comes, and that you value tolerance of people. You know, if you recognise that moral equality, then even if you really hate somebody or what they're saying, you still recognise them as a human. And here they are sort of endorsing this narrative that almost like separates beings into, you know, pupils into categories, you know, human categories. And I think that what that will do is that for those that believe it, it will be quite horrible. And a lot of more people will just become very cynical or turned off. And actually that's not, I mean, I don't think young people are stupid. They're not all going to imbibe this stuff very critically. They are often very intelligent and often can see through a lot of the specious arguments in this. But unless there is a positive alternative, then where is anyone to go other than to either switch off or become cynical? And that's not great. That's not...
How many schools are these third-party organisations in, do you think?
Well, you know, we've done a sample, and from our sample of 49 organisations, we've found 136 plus schools that we've seen. I mean, we don't know what the relationship is between them, whether they're just in there for a lesson or sent them some advice, or whether they're in their school for like a year or 2 years. That we don't know. But that's not really the point, because every time a school hires the services of one of these organisations, that organisation is getting legitimised just that little bit more. And it doesn't really matter what they do, they've got the credibility. And, you know, the government has no oversight of them, the professions have no oversight of them, parents, the public have no, it's very difficult. There's a parent here in the audience who's fighting a very bold and difficult case to try and get access to those materials. This is shocking. There is never could be entertained in any, I think, politician responsible for education in Britain's past, that it should come to this, that schools should be hiding.
Yes, you talked
materials.
about proselytising of critical race theory, which you say, very interestingly, masquerades as knowledge and uses the concept of lived experience to insulate itself from critical scrutiny and verification. So it's like a kind of moral system, isn't it, which doesn't brook any sort of challenge or argument. I'd like you to talk about that a bit, but also what the hell has the Department of Education been doing while this has been spreading through our schools? Anything?
I mean, it beggars belief, doesn't it, really? All this is going on, and we have a Prime Minister who says, well, let all the children stay until 18 and do maths. Even you don't have to be an Einstein to know that, maths is actually a kind of a type of subject that if you've had problems in years 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10, you're not going to catch up suddenly and, at the age of 17 or 18, right? It's just not that kind of subject. Clueless. And then we have, Keir Starmer's wittering on about oracy, but, as if oracy could exist without content, without any engagement in intellectually stimulating and aesthetically rich content. And I think, to me, honestly, there's all the race stuff, but the thing that really gets me as a teacher is just the intellectual and imaginative impoverishment of what this is doing to the curriculum, which was not in a very good position to start with. And this is just, one more little nail that I think is just, not nail, I don't mean a nail, I mean a hammer blow that is kind of shattering the curriculum and making it nothing more than a political weapon.
So you talked about children, particularly the younger children, the target of that dreadful book I read, not being capable of the abstract thinking needed to test the reliability of these sort of white supremacy type things. They'll just see the teacher saying it to them and think that's a way to be a good person, won't they?
Absolutely. The other thing these people don't have any knowledge of is child development, right? Or how children acquire language, how they develop abstract thinking. I'm an English teacher, and I know from experience, you probably know it too, is that, when you teach young children nouns, they grasp concrete nouns fairly quickly. But when you come on to collective nouns and then abstract nouns, it becomes an awful lot harder. So if an abstract noun like racism or systematic racism or white privilege, will by a young person be, by the majority of young people, maybe not everyone, will be understood as a moral precept, not as an idea that you have to sort of walk around mentally and scrutinise and ask questions of and look for the strong points. It might have strong points, or look for the weak points. And that's that intellectual curiosity that classrooms should be. And this ideology in classrooms is the utter antithesis of that, because pupils will be too scared to really say what they think.
Yes, and everything becomes kind of based on the colour of their skin. You've said that we conclude that in some cases these third-party organisations in school represent a clear and present danger in terms of democratic accountability and educational standards. And you quote something from Civitas, that the proliferation of external providers in our schools amounts to a revolution by stealth. Now, are you saying there's a calculated attempt to indoctrinate kids with these highly contentious anti-racist theories, or is it more diffuse than that?
Okay, well that phrase I must thank Joanne Nadler for. It's in her Civitas report. No,
this sounds quite scary. Doesn't it?
It does, and it is scary, but it's not a conspiracy, right? It's not like there's anybody sitting there working it out. I think to understand this moment, you really have to take a step back and think about what has existed, what has been going on in education. I would say since the 1988 Education Reform Act. Now, that was introduced to address certain problems people thought were causing were causing detrimental effects in schools then. But what it did was unpin every single existing relationship between university, exam board, local education authority, and schools at a local level. So a whole network of carefully crafted institutional relationships and standards that had developed since 1944 were smashed in a very short space of time. Mm-hmm. And what has come into that has been, anyone who's involved in teaching here or education will have heard of the school effectiveness movement, a whole set of sort of remaking education along the lines of new business management. And that might make for good empirical databases, and it might please the OECD and the PISA bean counting people. Sorry, that's a bit dismissive. There is a value in those kind of surveys, but they're so general and so broad, they can't really help at a local, on-the-ground level. And in that process, the ethic of education as a human and humane transmission of culture, a cultural model of education, has been lost. And I think that's left the profession ethically stripped, ethically naked, and I think the social justice agenda is speaking to that. So it's not a conspiracy, but it's a kind of, I mean, that isn't to deny there are activists with a clear agenda, but they wouldn't get the time of day if this hadn't been going on beforehand.
You talked about these third-party organisations promoting contested political beliefs from critical race theory onwards, as if they were verified knowledge, and this being in breach of the duty of schools to provide impartial teaching. These third-party organisations are not educational bodies. They're primarily political in purpose. Is it illegal what they're doing, Alka?
Well, it's in the education. Yes, I would say actually, if we take the Education Act, sections 406 and 407, then yes, they are breaching those. But we have the Equality Act, and that no political person responsible has got the wherewithal to actually come down on one side or another on this, which is more important.
So the Education Act and the Equalities Act are
there are moments of real tension. There are moments of real tension that are being used, misused, intentionally, unintentionally, within the education profession in ways that are really changing the whole ethos of what schools should be. So you now have, every time a school says we are an anti-racist school, they're reneged on their educational duty. Right? Racism is a deeply horrible, pernicious thing that belongs in the adult world and has to be challenged and fought by adults on our terms. And we can argue about critical race theory, microaggressions, and all the rest of it as adult citizens where we are equal. A teacher teaching that to a child is not talking to an equal. And that really has to be understood. That's not to diss children. It's being a realist about our developmental beings as human beings. But I'm aware we're going to have to wind up soon, Alison, and then take some Q&As.
All right, sorry, we're
chat on all night.
Chatting away. Just to ask you, isn't there a need for schools to address racism in some way, not necessarily like this? You can't pretend it doesn't exist. So do you think that should be... do you think they shouldn't bother teaching it at all, or do you think there should be a way of talking about it?
No, I don't think you need to teach it as a discrete subject at all. I think if you're educating properly, you will be doing the best that schools can to produce citizens who can decide for themselves. I think at older ages, decide for themselves what causes they wish to support and not support. And that's a risk, right? That is a risk. But if you love freedom and if you love democracy, then you have to accept that risk. If you want to be safe and, make yourself as cosy an environment as possible, then you're kind of always batting off, you're always restricting. But that's not educational. And you can, at older ages, sure, well, To Kill a Mockingbird, for goodness sake, one of the books that some schools have chosen not to teach because of its white saviorism. I mean, just you couldn't imagine a book more suitable for being not just a beautifully written book about a beautiful story and interesting characters, and who doesn't love Gregory Peck in the film, but you know, really to ask those questions, you know, was Atticus Finch right? You know, was it? Yeah. You know, you could have that discussion. Yeah. You don't ban it. You don't stop teaching it.
So there's also the danger. We know that in the educational system that one of the worst, in fact, probably the worst performing group are white working class boys, aren't there? So if you're saying to them, you know, you're an oppressor of X, well, clearly they're not doing very well at oppressing anyone, are they? So there's a danger, isn't there, of causing bitterness, don't you think? And a sense of unfairness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the complement of that is entitlement. You will get, you know, a sense of real grievance on both sides, actually. It's really not good for anyone. It's not good for, you know, because basically it's saying you don't really have any agency, or your agency counts for very little. If you're white, then, you know, no matter how much you try and be kind and nice, you're always kind of going to be a little bit whiff of colonialism about you. And if you're not white, and
not much of that in the part of South Wales I come from. We didn't have anything to do with colonialism.
But you've got your own wackiness in the Welsh curriculum there. But you know, and then if you're not white, it's like, well, you know, anything. It's like this idea that any progress you make is kind of has to be at the expense of somebody else, or you have to be. You need to be. The world needs to be changed for you to succeed. Not, you know, it doesn't afford you the dignity and respect of being able to face the world as it is and make our own way in it.
And when we look at our country, we think we have, you know, whatever your politics, we have got a Prime Minister and a Home Secretary and a Foreign Secretary who are from, you know, either, you know, Indian, Hindu...
Just very quickly, and I'd like to perhaps maybe just end on this thing. This is a country where Frederick Douglass, everyone will have heard of Frederick Douglass, came to Rochdale in 1847, and when he left, he said, "I came into this country a slave, and I leave a free man." And the reason he said that is because the Quakers stayed with John Bright and his family, and the Quakers raised the money for his manumission. And that was in 1847. So when people go on about we must tell the forgotten history of colonialism and slavery and Britain's role in this, sure, but make sure you tell the much more forgotten history, in my view, of the people whom were repelled.
Can I just say a big, huge thank you to Alka and Don't Divide Us.
Thank you, Alison.